Hello, everyone. Pastor George here. Excited to be here. Excited to do a new thing. So, firstly, I want to apologize about what happened last week. That snowstorm, ice storm, whatever it is, came in and shut us down for the day. So I left my computer here, which is why I wasn't able to record it from home, which stunk because I did a lot of research for this video. And now what I'm talking about is like 2 weeks old in the news, but actually maybe that's the best time to talk about it because temperatures have cooled down, and already, this is just the way the news works. Everyone's probably already forgotten about it, but just because everyone forgot about it doesn't mean that it's not important or interesting. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. You'll probably know what the title, what I talked about, just based on the title of this video. But here is what our topic for today is. You'll see this. It says a short honeymoon for Catholics in D.C. as Vice President Vance clashes with bishops on migration. Excuse me. This happened. I'm sure you've heard about this if you pay attention to the news. Basically, J.D. Vance, who's the Vice President of the United States, was talking, and he talked about how that he was critiquing the Catholic Church. I think this AP article does it all right. He's Catholic himself. He's a convert. It says the news vice president, a Catholic convert, accused the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops of resettling illegal immigrants in order to get federal funding. New York Cardinal Timothy Dolan, who gave the invocation shortly before Vance took his oath of office, denounced the remarks as scurrilous and nasty. You don't see the word scurrilous used that much anyway, do you? But here's the thing. This is the important thing. When he was talking about this, he claimed that the concept from medieval Catholic theology, Ordo Amoris in Latin, justifies the Trump administration's America First immigration crackdown. He contended that the concept delineates a hierarchy of care to family first, followed by neighbor, community, fellow citizens, and lastly, those elsewhere. That's probably what you saw, right? And what we're going to focus on today is this Ordo Amoris. I think is very important to talk about. But first, just to look at the reactions to this, right? So this is all the news that I pulled up, and that's where I found that one article that we just read from. But you'll see different things, take different stances. And so, like the Cincinnati Enquirer says, J.D. Vance is obviously and unremarkably correct about the order of love. I mean, I should say not they say this, an opinion for them says this, but that's an article thing that they read. And then a National Catholic Reporter, J.D. Vance is wrong. Jesus doesn't ask us to rank our love for others. And then, you have people kind of in the middle. Of course, you have like this, or it says J.D. Vance is wrong about everything. And apparently the Pope weighed in. I'm not too worried about that because my interest is not so much on that, what I want to talk about, but I actually want to talk about the Ordo Amoris. So Ordo Amoris is Latin for the order of love. Okay, so, and what this means is who should we love first? To say it's a medieval concept is slightly wrong. It certainly is developed pretty highly in the Middle Ages by some of the so why one person we're going to look at and other theologians and things like that. But this is an actual issue for Christians. It seems like it's an easy answer, but it really isn't. Well, it is in some senses, but then how you live that out is not as easy, which is why there's been so much ink spilled on this particular topic. And I saw like all sorts of crazy things people said about this. I remember someone said that J.D. Vance preaches a false gospel. My interpretation of this, which by the way is a crazy thing to say, because then, as you're going to see, you're going to lump quite a few really important people into this, and to say that he preaches a false gospel is to say Augustine preaches a false gospel, which is crazy. So I just want to point out the important thing here, and this is why we should take seriously theology as data. And what I mean by that is when theologians engage in data, at least kind of your standard Christian theologian, what they're doing is they are taking into account a wide breadth of scripture if they're doing their theology well, right? So the idea here is that you're looking at all the different points and connecting the dots. So like probably the best example of this is the Trinity. So the Trinity, as our Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormon, and Muslim and Jewish and other friends would point out the word Trinity is never found in the New Testament. It's a theological concept, and that's always seen as some smoking gun, right? It's not, because the Trinity is a concept that was formed by Tertullian to make sense of biblical data. The Father is declared to be God in person, the Son is declared to be God in person, and the Spirit is declared to be God in person. How do we make sense of that? We develop a theological concept for it. Okay? We do the same thing with like omnipotence or omniscience. Those are not words that are found in the Bible, but from the way that God is described, we can go, okay, this is what the Bible says about God. It says that he's all-knowing, right? So all that's being said, that's what theology is, and we're going to do data research, and we're also going to look at how other people interpret this from church history. So from the early church, the patristic period, the medieval church, and then the Reformation period. And I want us to just take our politics for the second and push them to the side. Let's just listen to what God's word has to say, and what other knowledgeable and wise Christians, they don't have to be right about everything, have also had to say about it, and then we can form our own conclusions. All right, so we're going to take politics and put them to the side, and in symbolic gesture of that, I'm going to close those tabs. All right, here we go. So first thing we're going to look at is 1 Timothy 5. So in 1 Timothy 5, Paul is talking about instructions for the church here. And you'll see this right here. This is talking about people in the church. He says, if anyone, verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So when we are talking about order of love, and we're talking about responsibilities we have to people, Paul here places care for your family incredibly important. Okay? Incredibly important. Because if you do not do that, you have denied the faith. This is actually really strong language, right? If you're not even providing or taking care of your own family, you've missed the boat, right? That's the idea here, is Paul is saying. All right, so already, because people are obviously going to appeal to other places in Scripture, if we're going to make sense of this all together, then we have to take seriously what Paul says here. Paul says that if you don't care for your own family, your household, meaning not just blood relatives, but other people who are in there, like slaves and maybe clients, things like that. The Roman household is a little complicated. That you're not allowed to, that you're worse than an unbeliever. Pretty interesting, right? So before we go, everyone is equal in our love, that we should love everyone equally, or we don't have special duties in some areas to love some people in before, I don't think is the best word, but in precedent before others, then yeah, we might actually have that going on. All right, so next one I want to look at here is one of people's favorites to talk about, and important. So don't let just because it's everyone's favorite, say that it's not useful, right? So this is the parable of the Good Samaritan. This one was the one I saw a lot of people critiquing Vance quote insanely, right? So something to note about the parable of the Good Samaritan is just the context of it, right? So this is important because this man comes to Jesus and he says, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And he says, what is written in the law? Have you read it? And the man answers, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Quotes from the Torah. And he said to him, you've answered correctly, do this and you will live. But he, so the man, desiring to justify himself to Jesus, says, who is my neighbor? So the guy who is doing this is saying, how do I do this even more, right? Like, how do I really prove that I can do this sort of thing? And so Jesus says, all right, well, let me tell you. And he gives a hypothetical scenario. Okay, so something to note here is that this is love for people that you haven't met. All right, so this is not something that is a lived experience or whatever, but it's supposed to be if you're in this situation or with the mindset that you should have towards others. And he gives the people that were hated, the Levites, or not the Levites, excuse me, the Samaritans by the Jews. So you have the Levite, the priest will pass by, and then a Samaritan comes by and helps the man. And the idea here is that the Samaritan is the one who's loving his neighbor as is required by the Torah, right? And so we are supposed to be like the Samaritan and help people who we encounter who need it. This does not mean that you go around the world to help someone, and or that person is more in your sphere than someone else. And we're going to talk about kind of these spheres and important thing there. It doesn't mean you don't do that if that's what you're called to do or if it's needed, right? But it's just about kind of understanding time and place, and that's going to become important when we kind of deal with this theologically and philosophically here. All right. So another thing to look at is I want to look at Isaiah 16. So in Isaiah 16, God is giving prophecies like against other nations and things like that, especially Moab and these other areas around Israel. One of the things that's important here is that this is talking about other nations and what they should be doing. But the problem is that they haven't been doing those types of things, right? So, for instance here, this is about Moab. Let me see here. Yeah, so Moab is a place, yeah, I'll just choose a random one. It's all kind of the same here, but the important thing is what Moab is not doing, right? So Israel is told to give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of noon, shelter the outcast, do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you, be a shelter to them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more, and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, then the throne will be established in steadfast love, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice, and is swift to do righteousness. We have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is, of his arrogance, his pride, and his insolence. In his idle boasting he is not right. Therefore let Moab wail for Moab, let everyone wail, mourn utterly stricken for the raisin cakes of Kir Hareset. So here, right, so the leader of Moab, or the rulers of Moab, the people in charge, are being judged by God as not caring for their people. And Israel is told when these people show up to care for them instead. Interesting thing, kind of a double meaning here, right, is that when these refugees or sojourners, whatever you want to call them, show up in Israel, they are supposed to be cared for. Important thing to note. But this is because Moab has failed in its duty to care for its own people first. Right, and that the idea here is because Moab is not doing its right job, then other people have to pick up a slack. Doesn't mean that Moab gets out of that. They're going to be judged and destroyed, and then the people are going to return and things are going to be made right. But that's kind of the idea. Again, a little bit complicated, right? All right. And point being, right, when we're talking about other people, this is also an important passage to think about. Speaking of Samaritans, right? So this is a Samaritan village rejects Jesus. This is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9. So when Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem, this is what happens. It says, he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered a village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him, but the people did not receive him because his face was set toward Jerusalem. Remember, Jews and Samaritans don't like each other, so he's heading toward Jerusalem. They know he's Jewish. They don't want anything to do with him. And when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? But he turned to them and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. So you can't hate people because they're different from you. You can't just say, oh, they've rejected us, so we should call down fire on them, right? And this is important when it comes to loving people and understanding, like, the bounds of it, because even people who actively are against Jesus here, they're not supposed to be burned up with fire. Okay? God will get his justice in the end, and that's what Jesus tells his disciples here. Important thing to know. All right, let's look at 1 Corinthians real quick. Remember, these are all data points. So I think this is pretty important because this is when it comes to like missions work and things like that. This is where it might be helpful. So Paul is talking about a collection that he's taking here, and he is taking a collection for the people in Jerusalem, right? He says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me." So basically what's going on is Paul is taking up a collection to help the church in Jerusalem, which is experiencing persecution and other problems. And so he says, hey, I'm going to, put this money aside. When you come, we'll send it with people you trust to go to Jerusalem and give it to the people that are there. Right? Now, this is in Corinth, in Greece. Jerusalem is far away. But even in the Christian mindset, it seems like there should be care for other Christians around the world, and that this is a connection that's important. They can't just be forgotten. You can't say, well, the only church that matters is the one here in Corinth. We have to care about churches in other places. Remember, that's important. Now, one that we definitely shouldn't miss. Whoops. Is in the greater part of the Good Samaritan, right? We have a bunch of these stories that are here, but I wanted to look at Luke 10, and in Luke 10, excuse me, where is this thing? Did I get this wrong? I could have gotten it wrong. Or I'm just like completely bizarre about what I'm focusing on here. This is what happens when you do something a week later, right? And you're like, oh, what did I mean by that note? All right, well, I'll get to that another time. I'm not sure what I meant by this. I'm sure I had a really good point, and it's just completely gone. Oh, I know what it is. It is about the Good Samaritan. This is what I wanted to focus on. All right, yeah. And this is one of my critiques of what J.D. Vance said. So he talks about in his order of love. This is it. Yeah, this is very important. It's a good thing I didn't miss this. It just took me a while to get my gears turning. He talks about the order of love, and he says certain people in certain, family, area, country, and then so on and so forth, right? But actually, if you look at the order of love given in the Good Samaritan parable and in the Torah, right? And who is the first or what is the first thing that you should love? The Lord your God. So the love of God always is the first order of priority. That's really important. We don't want to say others, the neighbor is the first order of priority, or family is the first, or nation, or even church, right? The first order of priority is God. That is the person you love first, and it's because you love God that you're going to love other people. That's the thing that I wanted. I'm so glad I figured this out for myself here. Remember about what I meant by my little note. I have these little sticky notes, which is how I structure these things. And so I'm glad I remembered what I was talking about. Yeah, you need to love your God first with all your heart, soul, and strength and mind and all that, and then your neighbor as yourself. So the idea here is that first you love God. We have to remember the pecking order here because we're talking about the order of love. And the idea that we love God first is going to set up how we feel about these other things. All right, next, we're going to talk about Christians. And this is one that often is very confused these days. So Galatians 6, verse 10, right? So Paul is talking about how bearing one another burdens. We all love this, right? but let each of us test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone and not in his neighbor. For each bear, he's talking about all that, right? But here's what he says at the end. He says, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone." Okay, so we're supposed to do good to everyone. Important. But, or and especially to those who are of the household of faith. So if we're forming our orders here, if we're taking into biblical considerations, we're told to love our neighbor as ourselves. Certainly our neighbors are the people in the church, right? Our families are people in the church. We have to do good to everyone, but especially people in the household of faith, right? So Christians, I would say, come before others in kind of our structure, our concentrical circles that we're building of people that we're supposed to love. And I'm going to talk about that because it's not supposed to love isn't really the helpful way of talking about it, because we're supposed to love everyone. But who are we to prioritize in our order of love? That's probably a better way to think about it. And again, this is a popular one to talk about, especially at our church. I try to bring this up as often as I can, right? Because we sing this song every Sunday. They'll know we are Christians by our love. But the important thing is that's not love for everyone, at least not in the verses that's quoting, right? When Jesus says, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for who? For one another." This is a very common theme in the New Testament. The idea that Christians are actually ahead and above a lot of others is important. And lastly, on the same topic, we're going to look at Mark 3:31. So this is a story, Jesus and his mothers and brothers. So it says, "And his mothers and brothers came, and standing outside, they sent him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and he said to them, 'Your mother and brothers are outside seeking you.' And he answered them, 'Who are my mother and my brothers?' And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, 'Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother.'" This is where we have a radical restructuring of family in the New Testament. Doesn't mean clearly that biological things can just be abandoned, right? If you have a household, you should care for them, clearly, as Paul points out here. But kind of the idea of who is your family also changes. And again, we have a prioritization of the family of faith over and against blood relation. As in that shows the deeper bond than even blood can be. Even if you have more responsibility for your children, for example, you can't abandon your children to, like, use money that you would be using to feed them to, I don't know, to go to the church or something like that, right? But you also have to have an understanding that your true family is found in the church. Anyway, this is really interesting. Obviously has lots of implications, not just for this topic, but other topics, right? Like the idea that we have to pray to Mary, or that Mary is super important. Jesus doesn't seem to think so, right? So this has implications for some Christian theology there as well. Now, and this also you can't end this conversation without looking at a verse that we actually read in church a few weeks ago. I just chose this before this J.D. Vance thing broke, and then when I saw this pop up, or when I saw that this was getting a lot of play online or whatever, I was like, oh man, I'm reading that in church this Sunday. And I just didn't talk about it because I didn't want to bring any wrong attention for it, because I don't want these things to be seen through a political lens. I want them to be seen through a theological lens. So anyway, God is giving laws to the people. And in 19, he says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as a native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So he says that when other people come, you treat them well. You treat them as you would your native born. You're supposed to love him as yourself. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is where you get a lot of the prefiguring, again, of what Jesus is going to teach people. Jesus isn't teaching his people new things. He's just making it clear about what the heights and importance of the law is, right? "I desire mercy, not sacrifices," I talked about in that sermon. So you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, and especially God says you care for the people because you understand what it's like to be in their shoes. At least if you understand your own spiritual history and what you are, you should understand what that is. All right, so we have a bunch of these circles of people that the Bible explicitly tells us to care for. And this is the problem, right? Because if we just do a cherry picking type of thing, you can pick any of these verses and say this is what's most important, right? And this is what people were doing in the response to the J.D. Vance thing, is they were just picking from different places. And I saw generally kind of two camps form. The more conservative camp would generally hold to the Ordo Amoris as J.D. presented it, but would often forget important things like the fact that God should come first, or the fact that there is explicit command to care for the neighbor and the stranger, right? And of course that makes sense given the political kind of ideas there. You are going to kind of forget those, or say that if they're later down the line, then they don't matter. That's kind of the failure of the Ordo Amoris and the idea of talking about it. At least one of the critiques of it is that to think that the farther it is down the line, the less it matters. That's not really the case at all. As you'll see in a little bit, it's not that it doesn't matter. It's just that there are certain limitations that we have as humans, right? But anyway, that's what I worry about, and that's what I've seen is people will basically go, "Oh, this small circle of people I like, that's why I have to love. Everyone outside of that is bad, right? Or not bad, but I don't have to love them." On the opposite side, you got the more progressive people who are just like, "Oh, everyone is your neighbor. You have to love all of them equally," which is a nice idea. But let's think realistically, or at least realistically and philosophically for a second. Can we actually do that? And I would say no, right? And this is something we're going to see from our three writers, is that we are spatially and temporally located. What does that mean? It means that I, Pastor George, am in this place right now. I'm in my office at 8:03 a.m. on February 13th in the year of our Lord 2025. I am not other places. I'm not in Africa. I'm not in Europe. I'm not in Asia. I cannot love those people because I'm not in the place unless they see this video, right? I guess like and helping them understand. That's great. But I'm physically and temporally located. I can't go back in time. I can't go forward in time. I'm stuck. All right. And I'm not capable of loving everyone equally at all the same time. It just is an impossible thing. Not because, the flesh is willing or the heart is willing, but the flesh is weak or anything like that. Right. It's just because I can't do it. I physically cannot do it. You can't do that sort of thing. Right. So you have one side that kind of draws a circle and says that's all that matters, and you have another side that just expands the circle endlessly and doesn't, and both of these don't really deal with the biblical data in a way that I find satisfying, and that the way that that's done, I think, is best exemplified in the Ordo Amoris, right? Which is of course a human thing. It can be wrong. I'm going to point out a way that one of these guys is wrong today, but I think the general idea of it is solid and helpful for thinking theologically about issues. So first person we're going to look at is St. Augustine here. So he's talking about love, right? That's kind of the whole idea here is all sorts of love. And there's two chapters, but they're actually, you can see kind of paragraphs here. This is from his book on Christian doctrine. So Augustine says, "Now he is a man of just and holy life who forms an unprejudiced estimate of things and keeps his affections also under strict control, so that he neither loves what he ought not to love, nor fails to love what he ought to love, nor loves that more which ought to be loved less, nor loves that equally which ought to be loved either less or more, nor loves that less or more which ought to be loved equally." Basically saying, you need to think about these things. You're supposed to love everything that you're appropriately and not love things that you shouldn't love, in ways that you should, that sort of thing, right? "No sinner is to be loved as a sinner." This is the important thing. No sinner is to be loved as a sinner. Who's a sinner? Everyone, right? "And every man," this is what he says, "every man is to be loved as a man for God's sake. But God is to be loved for his own sake." So this is where you see, again, Augustine focusing us there, right? "And if God is to be loved more than any man," true. So we already have our order. God first, right? "Each man ought to love God more than himself. Likewise, we ought to love another man better than our own body. So the idea is the conceptual framework for everyone, no matter their relation to you, is you are supposed to love them more than yourself, because all things are to be loved in reference to God, and another man can have fellowship with us in the enjoyment of God, whereas our body cannot. For the body only lives through the soul, and it is by the soul that we enjoy God. Right? So basically saying we serve other people because we can fellowship with them and enjoy God together, but our body can't fellowship with us, right? It's just flesh. So the important thing there is that he's drawing this distinction. But then in the next chapter, he fleshes this out more. He says, further, all men are to be loved equally. So right now, it's like, oh, it seems like Augustine is kind of more on the progressive side of this sort of thing. But then he steps back a little bit. And by this would be meaningless, calling him a progressive in his own day. Like, that would be meaningless, right? This is common parlance, so just remember that. But Augustine says, since you cannot do good to all, you are to pay special regard to those who, by the accidents of time or place or circumstance, are brought into closer connection with you. You see what he says there? He says accidents. But that doesn't mean negative thing. It just means coincidence, right? I just happen to be here with all of you instead of another church at another place, right? This is through God's sovereign plan. That's what Calvin is going to talk about in a little bit. But the idea here is that, like, you are just going to be by the people you're by. It's just going to happen in life. There's going to be people that live next door to you and people that live 30 countries away from you, okay? And then he gives an example. He says, for suppose you have some great deal of some commodity, so, money or wheat or whatever, right? And you felt bound to give it away to somebody who had none, and that it could not be given to more than one person. If two persons presented themselves, neither of whom had either from need or relationship a greater claim upon you than the other, you could do nothing fairer than choose by lot to which you would give what could not be given to both. So let's say you have a certain amount of money left over, or let's say you go out, you buy a breakfast sandwich, and someone comes up and says, hey, I'm starving, can I have that? Well, okay, yeah, you give it to them, right? Because there's only one person that's there, and that's the thing you should do. What happens, though, if people come up to you, two homeless guys, let's say, and they both ask you for the sandwich? What's your response supposed to be? Well, Augustine says here, neither of these guys has any greater claim on you. This is what we're talking about, like, maybe family. So if your child is starving, maybe the child would be the person to give your sandwich to, right? That's probably what Augustine would say. But neither of these guys have any claims, so it's just like, well, random at that. Just give it to one of them, because that's the best that you can do in that situation, right? That's the idea, is that you only have so much of some things, so you can give it to only one. And so he continues, he says, just so among men, since you cannot consult for the good of them all, you must take the matter as decided for you by a sort of lot, according as each man happens for the time being more or closely connected with you. And so Augustine is saying you should care for everyone, but you are located in a place to serve other people, and so there might be people that are closer to you, and you should be caring for those people first. And this is just a rational kind of thing to do, right? It doesn't mean that you care for the people you like. That's not what he's saying. It just means that there are people who are closely connected with you, and those are the people that you should, be caring about. So, like, people in China, I'm very distant from, but Chinese immigrants in this community, much closer, right? And so I have a duty to serve them in a way that I have a different duty or a different precedent to serve people who I never met and have no connection to in any substantial way. All right. So now we're going to look at Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas, we're actually going to be talking about him not this Sunday, but 2 Sundays from now in my Christian Ed class. Pretty important guy in the Middle Ages. Basically the big thinker for the medieval period, although, as I'll talk about, he wasn't actually that famous within his own lifetime. It was after he died that he started to become more and more famous, which is very interesting, right? but he's definitely one of the big names of Christian theology. It's like Augustine and Aquinas, and various other people. But those two are like, especially in Western churches, very important to think about. And also philosophically. So if you study philosophy, even if I try to do it outside of theology, you're going to run into Aquinas. In any case, right? Aquinas here says, so basically the whole way, he's a massive book. It's called the Summa Theologica. And in it, he answers a bunch of different questions. And so this is all on love and things like that. And the question for this one is whether we ought to love one neighbor more than another. So he's trying, and you can see he's very rigorous in the way he thinks. He gives objections as to why you shouldn't do this. And he quotes, Augustine. He quotes the philosopher, which to him is Aristotle. Very important. And so he goes through all this, and he says this. But the thing I want to focus on is here where it says one's obligation, this is on the contrary, right? One's obligation to love a person is proportionate to the gravity of the sin one commits and acting against that love. Now, it is a more grievous sin to act against the love of certain neighbors than against the love of others. Hence, the commandment, Leviticus 10:9, he that curses his father or mother dying, let him die, which does not apply to those who cursed others than the above. Therefore, we ought to love some neighbors more than others. So his whole point here is that we are supposed, and it's not in the sense of like, you can hate people or whatever. That's not his argument here. But he's trying to say we have to, in some sense, choose who we can love in certain circumstances or how we love them, right? And he gives an example from Leviticus. And that he brings this out in order to point out that God gives a special curse, right, to those people who curse their parents, that they shouldn't be doing that sort of thing. It's not for other people, but especially for the parents, you don't do that. So God is making distinctions between relationships. We have to make distinctions as well. And the most thing that he does is again, he applies this idea of unreasonableness, right? He says this is unreasonable, for the affection of charity, which is the inclination of grace, is not less orderly than natural appetite, which is the inclination of nature, for both inclinations flow from divine wisdom. Now we observe in the physical order, so he's just talking about the world, right, that the natural inclination in each thing is proportionate to the act or movement that is becoming to the nature of that thing. This is very Aristotelian. But basically just saying, listen, things act in accordance with the things around them and their nature, right? And then you can see some old physics here. So if you want to know how they thought about like gravity and stuff, you can see this. He says, thus in the earth, the inclination of gravity is greater than in water because it is becoming to earth to be beneath water. Right? So basically the idea here is that the medievals and other people, this goes back to Aristotle, it's not just the medievals and other philosophies, but that things fall to the ground because they have more earth in them, right? And obviously everyone realized that water was above the ground, like in the ocean or lake or whatever. So earth was below that, so it drops to the bottom, that sort of thing, right? Not great physics. But the idea here is he's just drawing a distinction for us to show that things that are like each other flow to each other. So again, this idea of nearness. So he's basically pointing out how, in their view at the time, the natural world reflects this idea. Consequently, the inclination also of grace, which is the effect of charity, must needs be proportionate to those actions which have to be performed outwardly, so that, to wit, the affection of our charity be more intense towards those to whom we ought to behave with greater kindness. This is the idea, right? To whom we ought to behave. The idea that we have special obligations to certain people. We have special obligations to our family. We have special obligations to other Christians. We have special obligations to God. We have special obligations to the nation, to people in our area, and then to general humanity, right? That's the idea. That's not my order that I'm giving you. I did that out of order, but I'm trying to show you that there are certain things we ought to love in our world, right? We must therefore say, even as regards affection, we ought to love one neighbor more than another. The reason is that since the principle of love is God, God first again, and the person who loves, it must needs be that the affection of love increases in proportion to the nearness to one another or other of those principles. For we stated above, Article 1, wherever we find a principle, order depends on relation to that principle. So and then he replies to the objections and stuff like that. Now, I just want to point out that in in the in like we do have our cultural blind spots, and so I'm going to show you Aquinas's and why these guys can be wrong, but why we can take them into a account and care about it. And so here it's like to love his children, he answers all sorts of things. And there's a whole question. He says whether a man ought to love his mother more than his father. And his question is that his answer basically is this, right? Strictly speaking, the father should be loved more than the mother, for the father and mother are loved as principles of our natural origin. Now, the father is principle in a more excellent way than the mother, because he is the active principle, while the mother is a passive and material principle. Consequently, strictly speaking, the father is to be loved more. So here, right, he's using Greek philosophy and basically saying that the father is to be loved more than the mother because he's the active one. Not a great argument, okay? Which is why you have to look at it. You'll see here that he's not really quoting a lot of the Bible. He quotes a lot more of Aristotle. All right, so you just have to take these things into account, that we might have our own cultural blinders as to why we would order these things, and that's kind of the point of the political attachment to this, is our politics might impact this, but we want to kind of put those aside and do our best to just take what the Bible says and then try and build off of that. All right, and lastly, I want to look at John Calvin and his Christian Institutes. I have them on the shelf over there, but have them pulled up here for you. And this is actually really important because he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan here. And so we're going to use Calvin to kind of bring all of this home for us. So this is what Calvin says. He says, our Savior, having shown in the parable of the Samaritan, Luke 10:36, we read that, right? That the term neighbor comprehends the most remote stranger. There is no reason for limiting the precept of love to our own connections. So firstly, he states, right, that neighbor even includes strangers. All right? And he says you don't limit your love to people only your connections. And he says, but then he says this. He says, I deny not that the closer the relation, the more frequent our offices of kindness should be. So the closer these people are to you, the more frequent your loving of them should be. For the condition of humanity requires that there be more duties in common between those who are more nearly connected by the ties of relationship or friendship or neighborhood. Again here, right? This is what Augustine called accidents. This is what I call, spatial temporal location, whatever you want to call it. He's saying that there are certain people that you are going to be tied with in family, in friendship, in neighborhood, and those are the people that you are going to be showing more kindness and love to because they are around you more, right? And he says this is done without any offense to God, by whose providence we are in a manner impelled to do it. And so this is Calvin's argument, is that actually providentially we are required to love these people because God has, in his sovereign will, placed us exactly where we are for a purpose, right? If we were meant to be in a place loving a certain people, we would be there, or God would put it strongly on our heart to go and be there, right? But if we are here, we have to love the people that are around us. And Calvin says, but I say that the whole human race, without exception, are to be embraced with one feeling of charity, that here there is no distinction of Greek or barbarian, worthy or unworthy, friend or foe, since all are to be viewed not in themselves but in God. Again, this idea, if we put God first, it really does shape how you would view a lot of this. If we turn aside from this view, there's no wonder that we entangle ourselves in error. Wherefore, if we would hold true course in love, our first step must be to turn our eyes not to man, the sight of whom might oftener produce hatred than love, but to God, who requires that the love which we bear to him be diffused among all mankind. So that our fundamental principle must ever be, let a man be what he may, he is still to be loved because God is love. Right? That's the idea here. This is why this is my biggest umbrage, I guess, with the thing that J.D. Vance said, is that he just left out God. And maybe that's because he was speaking in a political sense. And he doesn't want to freak people out because people hate when you mention that type of stuff and all the religious things. But I don't know. I think that it's worth saying because it helps ground our conversation and helps us see kind of the common ground that we have. Right? Of course, like, if it's within our power, we should try and care for as many people as possible. But the whole point of the order of love here is that we have to, or have certain duties to people in our life, people around us. And that God has placed us here to care for those people, and that they would take precedence in a situation where we are forced to choose. And so the idea here is that if we're able to properly structure that, then we'll be able to love everyone equally. You know, we have to have faith that God has placed people in other people's lives to care for them, right? And when we can, we help out. But we have special duty to the people around us to love them first and deal with that. And again, not the people we like, not the people with our same political ideas or same skin color, things like that, right? We have duties to others as well, right? So if you were to ask me kind of to structure circles, right, this is what I would say. And this isn't perfect. I know I can be critiqued, all this other stuff. Says God is in the center, most important. Then our immediate family. Then our or our household. Maybe household is a better term than immediate family. God, household, Christian household. Okay, like non-Christian neighbors, and then you kind of do concentric circles out of that. So like state, country, world, that sort of thing. Now, you'll notice that Christians are here in the center, which means that actually extends them a pretty wide geographic area, right? But we also have to take into account just our location. So you would have to just be careful with that sort of thing. But that's basically my argument, right? My argument is that what J.D. Vance talked about isn't a bad thing. It's not a false gospel. It's a ridiculous claim that I saw someone make. It's just a theological way of trying to deal with the data that we have in the Bible, and also just reality as it's experienced, right? We aren't God. We can't love everyone at the same time. That's the amazing thing about God, is that he's able to do that, right? That's why we're able to say, like, we should try and be like him, and there's no reason that we shouldn't love everyone at all times, right? We can, but in terms of how we apply that, especially, with ramifications for governance or for church budgets or for all sorts of things, really matters. It's a nice thing to say that and say, oh, like, we should love everyone all the time, but like, okay, how do you actually do that? And in the same way, we can't just say, oh, see, it's this little circle in the middle that I like the most. That's what matters. But if opportunity presents itself, I don't have to care for other people. Absolutely not, right? You do. So the idea here is just that you heard probably a lot of people talk about that, and I want to give you something to chew on and think about when it comes to how to apply this idea of loving your neighbor, because you've probably thought about it before, because this is a very important command that we can't just get rid of, right? We have to think about how to do it. And I think that the amazing thing about church history is we have so many wise people that we are able to build upon them, and of course critique them when they're wrong, but also use them as a helpful way of thinking about a lot of these issues that we run into. So I hope you guys found that interesting. I know it's like weeks late, but hopefully that made it a little bit better, actually. In any case, thanks for joining me this morning. I will see you on Sunday for worship. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, and peace out.